Tennesse, got the fucking juice.
Silk is the new gold.
Yeah, it takes this shit serious.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of JT Sports Live. I'm your host, JT. We're talking college football today. We're going to call this College Football Tuesday. Got my Week 12 best bets. Got some thoughts on Tennessee versus Georgia. This is a season-defining game for Georgia because with the loss, they would pretty much be all but eliminated from playoff contention. They got to win this game to keep their playoff hopes alive. Florida has a chance to do something really funny, and that's pull off the upset against Brian Kelly and LSU and really make their season spiral left. Should a one-loss Indiana team be in the playoffs over a two-loss SEC team? Let's say that Indiana loses to Ohio State, and you're making the debate between them and a two-loss Alabama, two-loss Ole Miss, a two-loss Georgia, a two-loss Tennessee. Does Indiana deserve a spot at the dance over a two-loss SEC team? Who's the coach of the year in college football this season? Is it Curt Cignetti, who's delivered the best season in program history for Indiana football, or is it Deion Sanders at Colorado, having the Buffs in playoff contention, possibly winning the Big 12 title? Florida State's future is a sinking ship right now under Mike Norvell. I want to discuss why this program set themselves back several years with how bad of a season this has been. And college football has a quitting problem that nobody seems to be talking about. We were all in favor of guys being able to transfer whenever they wanted to, but transferring in the middle of the season when you get benched or you're not getting playoff time is something that I'm not really in favor of. Shout out to everybody that's tuned in, wherever you're watching, YouTube, X, Facebook. Smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, hit that bell icon so you get notified when we go live and drop new content. If you're new, check us out on all podcasting platforms, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you get your podcast from. The JT Sports Podcast is available. The link is down in the description down below. And without further ado, or shout out to Kate Roan with the $5 donation. Greatly appreciated as always. She says, powerful JT Sports Live. Did College Football Tuesday. Man, conveniently, it's my day off too. Thanks, man. Hey, I'm glad that you're tuned in. And we greatly appreciate the $5 donation. As always, one of our biggest supporters on the podcast. Let's dive into it. Georgia's season is on the line this week against Tennessee. If Georgia loses to the Vols this weekend, they will have 3 losses, which pretty much would eliminate them from college football playoff contention. Both of these teams are exactly similar because Tennessee, Nico Imaviava hasn't really played that good since the first month of the season. And Carson Beck, he's thrown 2 or more interceptions in 3 out of his last 4 games. So you got 2 teams right now that are heavily dependent on their defenses. Tennessee has the best defense in college football, in my opinion. They're 5th in points per game allowed. They're 2nd in yards per play allowed. They're 12th against the run. They're 14th in pass defense, and they are top 20 in takeaways. And you got a Georgia defense that isn't too far off, but the difference between Tennessee's defense compared to Georgia defensively is that Georgia's secondary has been inconsistent at times this year. Tennessee, though, their secondary has been really good. They got a lot of athletes on the back end, and you couple that with the best pass rush in America led by potential top 5, top 10 pick James Pierce Jr., you got a complete defense. And whoever is going to win this game is not going to be decided by less than maybe 4 points. I expect this game to be an old defensive slugfest. I wouldn't be surprised if we get one of those 16-13 kind of games, because the offenses have been very inefficient for both of these programs. Tennessee, their offense is mainly carried by their running back Dylan Sampson, who has ran for over 100 yards in every game this year. He's had about 3-4 games this year when he's ran for over 130 yards on the ground or more. He also has 20 touchdowns on the season. He's averaging 5.5 yards per carry. And he has over 1,000 yards rushing as well. He's been the best running back in the SEC this year. And if Dylan Sampson can't get going in this game and Georgia's run defense is able to neutralize him, Tennessee is going to be in a lot of trouble. Because what has helped Tennessee take some of that pressure off of Nico is the fact that you have the ability to run the football dominantly with Dylan Sampson. But Georgia's run defense is 7th in the country in rushing yard, or 17th in the country in rushing yards per game allowed. If Tennessee is forced to be a one-dimensional team and Nico has to throw the football 35, 40 times to win this game, I love Georgia's chances to save their season. But if this is a game when Dylan Sampson gets going and Georgia gets pummeled on the ground, they get bullied, they get pushed around, I don't see how they win this game. Because the thing with Nico is that the difference between him and Carson Beck is he takes care of the football. He may be a little bit gun shy. He may struggle to have consistency with his accuracy, getting those deep plays downfield. What has been uncharacteristic about the Vols offense this year has been their inability to generate a lot of explosive plays in the pass game. We saw them have a lot of explosive plays throwing the football early during the season, but when they've gotten into conference play since their game against Oklahoma, they haven't really had a lot of those big one-play touchdowns that you've seen them have earlier. But with Dylan Sampson being so good, you know, you don't really care about your lack of explosiveness in the passing game. But if you get your bread and butter taken away, which is your ground game, you're going to be in trouble. Because Georgia has a defense where you don't want to get into a game where you got to go old school Mike Leach air raid, because that's not winning football against Georgia. Think about when Alabama and Ole Miss have beaten Georgia this year. They were able to do it playing complementary football. They were good running the football, but they also had the ability to throw the football when needed. And what makes Georgia such a strange team to gauge is that they looked like they were down and out when they lost to Alabama and they barely beat Kentucky by 1 point on the road. But just when you thought Georgia was down and out, they pull off a massive upset on the road against Texas. And the reason why I call it a massive upset is because going into that game, you had a feeling that was Texas' game to lose. They had home field advantage. They had the more talented roster. Georgia's offensive line has been really bad this year. Carson Beck has been erratic. You would have thought that Texas would have won that game convincingly, but instead, Georgia goes into Austin and they just completely take over that game. especially in the second half, in spite of Carson Beck's interceptions. That showed you how good of a team Georgia is. Even if they're not playing their best football, they can still find a way to sneak away with a win. But when they played Ole Miss, however, a game that you were really confident that Georgia was going to be able to win due to Lane Kiffin being unable to beat Georgia in past years and how one-sided that game was last year when they both played, you had a 5 out of 5 confidence level the Dogs win that game, but instead, you got completely bullied. Ole Miss was tossing you around like a cold salad. Are we going to see another game where Georgia rises to the occasion like they did against Texas? Or are they just going to be a complete no-show like we saw last week against Ole Miss? You would think that this is a bounce-back spot for Georgia because I can't recall the last time Kirby Smart has lost back-to-back games. And this is normally a team that when they're in situations like this, when they feel like their back is against the wall, they play their best football. But Tennessee, though, outside of that loss to Arkansas, they've been pretty consistent. And what makes me skeptical about Georgia is that we only have about 2-3 weeks left of the regular season, and we still don't know what Georgia's identity is. We know what Tennessee's identity is. They got a great defense. They don't need to score 30, 40 every game to win. All they need is for their offense to be good enough with their ground game that it allows them to lean on their defense to win games. It's going to be a dogfight for Georgia to get the 20 points in this game. Same thing can be said about Tennessee. But at least Tennessee has had the run game that they can lean on. Georgia, they don't have anything they can lean on. The run game hasn't been there. The passing game has been hit or miss due to the inconsistency with Carson Beck, his turnover issues, the pass protection not being good, and your wide receiver position not being good neither. You got 28 drops on the season. You're like top 5 in the FBS in drops. You got concerns about your offensive coordinator, Mike Bobo. You got more questions than answers about Georgia coming into this game, which is really scary because you should know what you are as a football team. But this is going to be the game that shows us everything we need to know about Georgia. If you win, then you could be one of those teams that maybe you get into the playoffs and out of nowhere, surprisingly, you do what Alabama did and you get into the Final Four. You see, Alabama looked a lot like Georgia last year. They didn't really have anything to hang their hat on. You didn't know what their identity was, but you did know that this was just a team that just knew how to find ways to win. And that's the kind of team Georgia is. They don't really have anything that you can say, oh, yeah, this is what we do good. This is what our identity is. They just find ways to win games based on the situation no matter what. So me personally, I like Tennessee to win this game. And I'm shocked that I'm saying this because Tennessee is playing on the road in Athens, and we know how tough it is to win in Georgia's home territory. But the reason why I like Tennessee is because, one, Nico takes care of the football. Carson Beck cannot afford to have any turnovers in this game. And I know that you can say that's cliche because you never can afford turnovers in any other games. But in a game like this, when you got a defense that's so good, this is the best defense that Georgia has played this year, all your drives have to count. You could have afforded a few mistakes here and there against Texas and even Ole Miss because you knew that your defense was going to be able to bail you out. And occasionally your offense, you have to hope that maybe they could get a big play or two. But in a game like this, big plays are going to be limited for Georgia. And the biggest weakness with Georgia's offense is their inability to block anybody up front, rather it be in pass pro or run blocking. Georgia's offensive line has been uncharacteristically bad, and you're going up against arguably the best defensive line in college football. And what makes this a concerning matchup for Georgia offensively is that last week you struggled against a defensive line in Ole Miss that is not too far off from how good Tennessee's offensive line is. And if you can't win up front, you can't win that line of scrimmage battle, then you already kind of lost. Georgia fans keep criticizing Mike Bobo's play calling, but you can only do so much when your quarterback has no time to throw. Unless Georgia's offensive line shows up in this game and they play at the level that we've been accustomed to seeing these Georgia offensive lines play these last couple of years under Kirby Smart, I don't see how they score more than 13 points in this game. As bad as how Nico has been and the best games Tennessee has played this year against better competition, at least he's been able to take care of the football, which means that you're not gifting Georgia any extra possessions. But Carson Beck, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when he's going to have a turnover. They got a turnover counter now for Carson Beck. He had several turnovers in their game against Texas, and they were able to win in spite of it. But when he had all those turnovers against Alabama, he dug the Bulldogs into a hole that they were unable to climb out of. And it's just really hard to see Georgia winning this game when you got a Tennessee defense that's not even allowing you to score more than 17 points per game. I could see Tennessee getting to 20. I'm having a hard time picturing Georgia getting to 20 just because what is their identity on offense? We go back to the identity crisis that Georgia currently is in right now. Tennessee doesn't need to throw the football for 400 yards, have 5 touchdowns out of Nico to win, although you would like that, but you know that you can run the football. Georgia can't really do anything. Your ground game hasn't gotten going. Trevor Etienne has been banged up the most of the season, and your passing game has struggled. Last week against Ole Miss, you only had 2 plays that went for more than 20-plus yards. So when your offensive line is as bad as what Georgia has been, you're going to have problems moving the ball and sustaining efficiency offensively. Tennessee's offensive line hasn't been any better, though. But the difference is Georgia's defensive line is not as good as what Tennessee's defensive line is. As a matter of fact, this is probably the worst Georgia has been up front on the line of scrimmage on both sides of the football in the last 4 years. So I like Tennessee to win this game, even though it's hard to bet against Kirby Smart when Georgia is up against the wall. I just feel with how good Tennessee's defense is, and with them being able to run the football so effectively with Dylan Sampson, I like them to get the win. 17-16 is probably my score prediction I'm going to go with in this game. This is going to be a game where we see a lot of punting. Scores are going to be at a premium. But with Nico taking care of the football, Dylan Sampson, I'm not expecting him to have a 130-yard game, but I do believe that he's good for at least a few big runs and maybe 1 or 2 touchdowns that gets Tennessee over the top in this game. And maybe this comes down to a last-second field goal to win it. I trust Tennessee more than I trust Georgia just because their team is a little bit more complete than what Georgia is, and their defense is the main reason for it. Now, I want y'all to hear me out. I know that it's really hard to trust Billy Napier to win any game against an above-average team in the SEC. But we've seen when Florida went up against Tennessee on the road, they played Tennessee really close in that game. And if it wasn't for a couple of red zone turnovers, they probably would have won that game. And one thing about Billy Napier, in spite of, how disappointing his tenure at Florida has been, he's shown the ability numerous times in the past to have Florida ready to play for these big-time games. Even if they don't win them, at least he's able to keep them close. He played Missouri pretty close last year. You played Georgia pretty close for the majority of that game a few weeks ago. You're going up against a LSU team where you have a very big advantage against LSU. They always say styles make fights. Well, what has been LSU's biggest problem this year? The same problem that cost them to lose to Alabama in blowout fashion, The same problem that cost them to lose to Texas A&M imploded in the second half of that game, nearly costed them that win against South Carolina, has been their defense's inability to neutralize dual threat quarterbacks. Against Jalen Milroe, he had 185 yards on the ground and 4 rushing touchdowns against you. Against Marcel Reed, he scored 3 touchdowns on the ground on 3 straight possessions in the third and fourth quarter against you. And Lenore Sellers, he had a pretty good day against you as well. DJ Lagway didn't play last week against Texas. I'm pretty confident that we see him play in this game. And if he does, I love Florida to pull off this upset because we've seen LSU's defense been unable to have success against dual threat quarterbacks. DJ Lockley was the #1 rated quarterback in last year's recruiting cycle. He's the sole reason why Billy Napier may still have a job right now, because if Florida is going to turn their program around under Billy, it's going to hinge on how good DJ Lagway is. And he almost played against Texas. He warmed up, but right before the game, they said, you know what, we're just going to sit you. We're going to be safe than sorry. We rather have you a little bit more well-rested for this game against LSU versus throwing you out there against, Texas in a game that Florida pretty much had no chance against because they had a bunch of backups and third stringers. And when you're going up against a team with a top 3 roster, it's going to be hard to win a game like that, especially on the road. But if you playing at home, you get a DJ Lagway back, it's going to be a tremendous boost to that offense, because the strength of Florida's offense is how well they can run the football. Not only is DJ Lagway a really good runner, but you also got a true freshman running back in Jahan Ball, who leads Florida in rushing. He has 411 rushing yards, 6 touchdowns on the ground, and he's averaging 4.6 yards per carry. What Florida does well is what LSU's defense struggles at, which is running the football. LSU can't stop it. We've seen numerous occasions LSU's defense get gashed on the ground. Hell, after Jalen Milroe scored his 4th touchdown last week, when they cut over the LSU sidelines, you saw Brian Kelly talking to his defensive coordinator, Blake Baker. I thought that he was saying, hey, bro, after this game, just clean up your office. You're gone. Because this has been the same issue that plagued LSU's defense last year. You couldn't stop dual threat quarterbacks, and you still are incapable of stopping a dual threat quarterback. Florida doesn't need to win this game throwing for 250 plus and 4 touchdowns to beat LSU. One thing that we know about LSU is that they're going to give you chances to beat them. What do I mean by that? Well, LSU is a team, outside of their defensive struggles against dual threat quarterbacks and against the run, offensively, they beat themselves because, for one, Garrett Nussmeier, as good as what he is at times, he makes a lot of NFL-level throws. He also has a turnover issue. And in the last couple of games that LSU has played in, he's had numerous bat-breaking interceptions at the really wrong moments. He had a costly interception in the red zone against Alabama last week, and he had 3 total turnovers in that game. He had 2 INTs and the fumble. He imploded in the second half against Texas A&M. He threw 3 interceptions. He kind of lost LSU that game against A&M. And Florida, even though their secondary has been vulnerable at times, they're 46 in takeaways. And this defense is playing the best that they have all season long, even in spite of all the injuries that they've had to deal with in the secondary. They got numerous starters out. But if Garrett Nussmeier kind of being a little bit of a gunslinger, being a little bit reckless and loosey-goosey with the football, that's going to help Florida win this game, because LSU is going to have moments where they beat themselves. Another reason why I like Florida to pull off the upset is that LSU's not good at scoring in the red zone, which is the big key to a lot of upsets in college football. Normally, a lot of upsets occur when you win the turnover battle and you also are better in the red zone. LSU is 86 in red zone scoring this year, which isn't good. That's been the biggest talking point that LSU fans have had about this offense. They are explosive. They do have a lot of good wide receivers. They are one of those teams that could take a 5-yard slant and turn it into a 40, 50-yard touchdown. But when they get inside that red area, the field gets condensed, half of the playbook is gone. That's where they struggle. They haven't been good running the football, so they're not really that good punching the ball and just out-muscling you once you get into the red zone. And two, with the erratic decision-making of Garrett Nussmeier, it makes it hard to trust him to make good decisions in the red zone. He's either going to cost you and take points off the board with an interception, or you're just not going to come away with a touchdown at all. So with LSU's inability to stop dual-threat quarterbacks, how Garrett Nussmeier has been unable to take care of the football, and LSU struggling to score touchdowns in the red zone, all three of these issues that LSU has votes well for Florida being able to pull off the upset. Because when you can't score touchdowns in the red zone and you got to settle for 3, it keeps a team like Florida that may not be as well coached as you or as talented as you in the game. Plus, you got a quarterback that's a turnover ready to happen. It also is going to give Florida more opportunities with the short field to score. And with how good they are running the football, that's going to tire out your struggling run defense. I don't see how Billy Napier doesn't at least cover that 4.5-point spread. I'm really confident that Florida wins this game. Billy Napier, that Texas game was really ugly. But LSU was far from what Texas is. And I know that we saw LSU a few weeks ago go on the road and beat Arkansas when everybody thought that was an upset spot. But this game is a little bit different because you're coming off 2 straight losses. It looks like your playoff hopes are down the drain. And you kind of got a feeling that this team has kind of tapped out. You know, with how demoralizing of a loss you just took to Alabama, you're coming off 2 straight tough losses against 2 really good opponents. This is the prime opportunity for Billy Napier to get a big-time win against a team that right now it seems like their season is on the brink of spiraling out of control with only a few weeks left to go. I know Florida has a lot of issues in their own right, but LSU's issues for a team that had so many high expectations coming into this year and to not play up to the hype, it kind of gives Florida a good opportunity to pull off this upset. Nobody really expects much from Billy Napier, but we have seen in the past that Billy Napier has had this Florida team ready to play against good teams. That Texas game was an outlier. Against Tennessee, they nearly won that game. Against Missouri last year, they almost won that game. Billy Napier has come close to pulling off a few close calls. And I could see Florida pulling off this win. And this isn't one of those games where you can judge a team by what their record is. I see a lot of you LSU fans saying how, well, Florida isn't a good team. They got a losing record. Record goes out the drain, all right? Your run defense has not been good this year. You've struggled against dual-threat quarterbacks all year long. This isn't about record. This game isn't about who has the better team. This is a game that is going to be dictated based off style. And Florida's style of football, running the football, if you get a healthy DJ Lagway, is going to be able to attack LSU's biggest vulnerability on their defense, which is their inability to stop the run. We've seen every time LSU has gone up against a dual-threat quarterback, they've struggled to contain them, and they've got blasted on the ground. Florida's playing with house money. They have nothing to lose in this game. And Billy Napier, I expect them to have this team ready to play, especially on the road in the swamp. It's going to be sold out. It's going to be a hostile environment. I'm expecting Florida to get this upset. Shout out to everybody that's tuned in. Shout out to my guy, LSU Hype Ninja. Shout out to King Malik. Shout out to everybody that's watching wherever you are. YouTube, X, Facebook. Smash that like button. Give us a follow. Share the stream if you haven't already. And check out the podcast. We are not just a YouTube channel. We are a podcast. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you get your podcast from. The JT Sports Podcast is available. The links are down in the description down below. If you enjoy and you want to support us, all we ask is that you give us a 5-star review. It literally only takes 15 seconds to do. Let's keep on rolling, man. We might not have a lot of time to get into everything I want to discuss because I want to watch the college football playoff rankings reveal. But I think we're pretty good on time. I want to give you guys my 5 best bets for Week 12 of the college football season. I'm rolling with Tennessee as a 10-point underdog on the road against Georgia. I don't see how Tennessee doesn't cover this 10-point spread. They are not really that far away from what Georgia is. As a matter of fact, both of these teams are pretty similar. They both have quarterbacks that haven't played good football. Their offensive lines are struggling. They're really dependent on how well they can run the football and how well their defense plays. What gives Tennessee the slight edge in this game is that they got the best defense in college football. You are averaging only 13.5 points per game, which is top 5 in the nation. You got a defense that only allows, 4.5 yards per play. Georgia's offense is going to have a hard time moving the football down the field like we saw them struggle to do against Ole Miss, who also has a really good defensive line. And Georgia doesn't have identity on offense. They can't throw the football well because of Carson Beck's turnover issues. Their offensive line doesn't allow them to throw the football downfield, nor doesn't allow them to run the football. At least Tennessee, they have something they can hang their hat on, which is how good Dylan Sampson has been this year. He has 20 touchdowns, over 1,100 rushing yards. He's been the best running back in the SEC this season. And with you being able to lean on him to generate offense, it takes some of that pressure off Nico. Carson Beck has to play pretty much a flawless game for Georgia to blow out Tennessee. And with how good the Vols defense is, I trust Tennessee to cover that 10-point spread. They may not win this game, but they definitely are locked to cover. I'm taking Syracuse as an 8.5-point underdog on the road against Cal. This is a game between two teams that are pretty much evenly matched. Cal does have a pretty good defense, but I don't see them being able to slow down Syracuse passing attack. This is one of those games that should be 45-41, 38-34. So if you're somebody who likes betting on overs, probably taking the over in this one is a safe lock as well. This is going to be a game where you're going to see a lot of points being scored and not really a lot of defense. And both of these teams are on the same level. There isn't a gap between either one of these teams. Cal isn't better than Syracuse. Syracuse isn't better than Cal, which is why I'm shocked that this spread is so high. I thought that Syracuse would be a 3-point underdog. You're giving Syracuse 8.5. Yeah, I'm going to take that any day of the week. And Syracuse hasn't really been blown out in that many games. Their biggest loss was to Pitt, and Pitt just had their number in that game. Their defense was doing a lot of things schematically that Kyle McCord didn't know how to handle. But outside of that game, Syracuse has been in the majority of games they played in this year, and they've been a middle-of-the-pack team in the ACC, just like Cal has been a middle-of-the-pack team in the ACC, which is why I think that this game is a sure bet for Syracuse to at least cover that 8.5-point spread. With how evenly matched these two teams are, it should be a close game. I love Nebraska on the road. That's a 9-point dog against USC. USC and Nebraska, they both are in the same situation. They're fighting for bowl eligibility. And Nebraska, they still got a really good defensive line. USC's offensive line has struggled all season long. They recently just made a quarterback change. We don't know how good USC's backup is going to be. And even then, Nebraska has a new offensive coordinator. I've never seen a program just hire an offensive coordinator late in the season, but Nebraska has done it. And Dylan Raiola, although he's been playing some bad football or average football these last couple of weeks, they were in a close game with Ohio State. And against a USC team that right now, they struggled against the run, they've missed tackles, they haven't been fundamentally sound on that side of the football, Nebraska should be able to stay in this game. I don't think there's a gap between either of these two teams. They pretty much are evenly matched. The records indicate that. The performances indicate that. Both these teams have struggled in one-possession games. USC, they might get out to a fast start, but as we've seen when they choked that lead against Penn State, they choked that lead against Michigan when they came back in that game, USC just doesn't know how to finish off games. And that's why I love Nebraska as a 9-point underdog. UNLV, I'm rolling with them as a 21-point favorite against San Diego State. UNLV is the second best G5 team in America behind Boise State. They play great defense. They got outstanding offense. It's called the go-go offense, which is really innovative. And ever since they made the quarterback change to Malik Williams, this has been the hard offense to stop because of how balanced they are. They can kill you on the ground, or they can beat you throwing the football as well. San Diego State, they got a bad defense. They struggle against the pass. They're not that good against the run. And offensively, they don't turn the football over, but they don't do a good job of moving the football. I expect UNLV to cover this spread by halftime. And lastly, I'm taking Ohio State as a 28.5-point favorite against Northwestern. Ohio State knows that they got a big challenge they got a big challenge next week against Indiana. And I'm pretty sure they want to get Northwestern out the way so they can bench their starters late in the third quarter, early in the fourth quarter to get them rested for that matchup, which is going to determine if they make it to the Big Ten championship or not. So Northwestern, they rank near the bottom of every category statistically in the Big Ten on offense and defense. There's no way that Ohio State shouldn't cover this. I just don't see how Northwestern can even score 10 points in this game in the first half with how good Ohio State's defense is and how inefficient Northwestern has been offensively this year. So these are my Week 12 college football best bets. Leave your best bets down in the comment section down below. If you roll with these, I only want the credit. I don't want the blame. Now, there's a few more topics I want to hit on before we get up on out of here. So right now, Indiana is currently 10-0. They play Ohio State on the road in Columbus next week. That game is going to determine if they make it to the Big Ten title game or not. And if they lose that game like how most people expect them to, we're going to have a huge debate on their hands. Are we going to put in a one-loss Indiana team over a two-loss SEC team? Because there are multiple SEC teams right now that are on the verge of finishing 10-2. So if Indiana has one loss, would it be justifiable to put them in the playoffs over a two-loss Georgia if they beat Tennessee, a two-loss Alabama if they win out, a two-loss Ole Miss, a two-loss Texas A&M if they beat Texas? You see, this is going to be a really toxic debate to have because everybody's going to talk about Indiana's strength of schedule. According to the website I like to use for all my statistics, teamrankings.com, Indiana has the 56th rated strength of schedule this year. But all of the potential two-loss SEC teams who they could get into the playoffs over are going to have a stronger strength of schedule. Georgia and Alabama are 1 and 2 in strength of schedule. Texas A&M is 9th. Texas is 11th. Let's say Texas has 2 losses and they lose to Texas A&M the final week of the season. Are you still going to put Indiana in the playoffs over them if Texas doesn't win the SEC? What about Tennessee? What if they lose to Georgia but they win out? Are you going to put Indiana in over Tennessee when Tennessee's best win of the season is against Alabama? And Ole Miss, their best win of the season is against Georgia. You see, the problem with putting a one-loss Indiana team in the playoffs is that it doesn't matter how big or how small the margin is that they lose to Ohio State. What matters is the overall schedule that Indiana has played relative to the SEC. Even though the Big Ten is undeniably the second best conference in college football, you can't justify Indiana being 11-1 and equate it to being 10-2 in the SEC and say, yeah, Indiana should be in over this 2-loss SEC team because they have the better record. Because being 11-1 in the Big Ten isn't the same as being 10-2 in the SEC. The SEC has just been an absolute dogfight. This conference has been eating each other alive due to the removal of divisions. We could have a situation where we have 6 SEC teams tied for first place, and it comes down to a coin flip of who are going to be the 2 teams that play in the SEC title game. This has undeniably been the toughest conference in college football from top to bottom in terms of the depth of elite teams or playoff teams that you have in this conference. In the Big Ten, you only have 3 playoff teams: Oregon, Ohio State, and Penn State, if you take out Indiana in that equation. Compared to the SEC that has about 6 teams that you can make an argument right now that deserve to be in the playoffs. And if I was the committee, I don't see how you could put a 1-loss Indiana team that doesn't have a ranked win in over any 2-loss SEC team, because the argument that we're making is that your record matters more than the strength of your schedule. And I know that you can't always define a team by strength of schedule, but during this selection process, when you have humans who are picking who gets in, who gets left out, everything has to matter. You got to use all the analytics, all the schedule metrics to determine who are the best 12 teams. You already are going to have 5 teams who get auto bids, so therefore you're going to have a small amount of spots available. And at least one team is going to get screwed. And Indiana is going to be that team that's going to cause a divisive debate, because you're making an argument that although they haven't played the schedule as good as what a lot of these 2-loss SEC teams have, you're making an argument that the eye test shows that with them winning a lot of their games by 3 possessions or more, because they are 4th in the nation in point differential, that they are a better team because of the eye test. But if you were to give Indiana Georgia's schedule this year, where you have to go on the road to play Alabama, Texas, and Ole Miss, does Indiana still have the same record as what they do right now with the schedule they've played this season? I strongly doubt that. You probably lose all 3 of those games and probably then some, with how tough the SEC has been. With conference realignment taking place, it has pretty much made the SEC the equivalent to what the NFL is. And what really irritates me is how people try to say there is bias with all these SEC teams being ranked so high in the playoffs, and they try to say that the SEC is overrated. The SEC isn't overrated. You have a lot of good teams in this conference. When you have so many good teams, you're bound to have situations like this where you got a team like Indiana that, yes, they do have a better record than those 2-loss SEC teams, but the strength of their schedule doesn't equate to the strength of difficulty in the schedules that a Ole Miss, a Alabama, a Tennessee, a Georgia, or a Texas have had to play. If you give any of these 2-loss SEC squads Indiana's schedule, not only are they undefeated, but they probably give Ohio State a more competitive game. Not saying Indiana's going to get blown out in that game, because I believe they can keep it close with how well coached they are, but Indiana, from a talent standpoint and from a schedule standpoint, it doesn't make sense to put them in over any 2-loss SEC teams. I know that record matters, but you also have to take into account the strength of schedule. For Indiana to get in my opinion, they have no choice but to win out. That's what it's going to come down to. You can call me biased, but I think I'm pretty logical with this. Because anytime a SEC team has played out of the conference, they've dominated. Clemson got dominated by Georgia. Alabama went on the road and slaughtered Wisconsin. It's not really a debate who's the toughest conference in America. Y'all keep trying to make this about bias. Take your emotions out of it. Let's use logic and metrics. The metrics show that all these supposed to be overrated SEC teams, not only are they rated higher in ESPN's FPI and a lot of the power ratings and indexes, but they're better teams than the majority of the Big Ten. The SEC, from a talent standpoint, has 6 playoff caliber football teams compared to the Big Ten, who only has 4. Oregon, Ohio State, Penn State, and Indiana. You can't say that I'm being biased, the committee's being biased towards the SEC, when the SEC, in terms of depth, has had more good teams compared to the Big Ten. You mean to tell me that you think Wisconsin, Iowa, Washington, USC, or even Michigan would be able to beat Texas A&M or Tennessee? When we saw Texas go on the road and beat Michigan, they slaughtered them. It wasn't close. Indiana only beat them by less than a touchdown. So we got to stop trying to say that the SEC is overrated when the strength of this conference is just unbelievably tough. If you were to put the best ACC team in this conference, that being SMU at the moment, or the best team in the Big 12, rather you want to pick Colorado or BYU, they would get 8 alive. And I know a lot of y'all are going to say, JT, we can't do one-if scenarios. Let's be logical about this. They wouldn't have 10 wins. That's a fact. If you put Indiana in the SEC with Alabama's schedule or Georgia's schedule, they wouldn't be in the situation that they're in right now. So if you are the committee, you're telling us that you can play a weak schedule and get in as long as you have a good record. I think that would be unfair, because then you get mad at these SEC schools when they schedule nobody's week 1, but you're not going to give them credit for beating the best teams in their conference. The SEC has a winning record against every Power 4 conference this year. That's not an opinion. That's a fact. Look it up. Remember when Virginia Tech was supposed to be a huge sleeper team in the SEC? Vanderbilt smashed them. Vanderbilt is the equivalent in the SEC to what Indiana is in the Big Ten. If you were to give Vanderbilt Indiana's schedule this year, they will be in the same situation. The fact that Vanderbilt is comparable to the 4th playoff contender in the Big Ten shows you how tough the SEC is. A lot of y'all keep trying to push back against this, but you're not using stats. You're not using metrics. You're going off opinions. I'm going off facts and analytics. You can't tell me that with Indiana's schedule, where their opponents have a win-loss record that is that's on the losing end, deserves to be in the playoffs over a 2-loss SEC team. This is why we should just make this the SEC Big Ten Invitational, because it's hard to gouge these teams on the same level when the schedules are incredibly different in terms of difficulty. What's the point of playing in the toughest conference in college football when you're going to get passed over for a team that is incredibly lower than you in strength of schedule? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't. Y'all keep saying it's wrong and stuff like that, but Indiana smashed teams that were not that good. What about when Georgia went on the road and smashed Texas? Which loss or which win is more impressive? Indiana blowing out Washington, blowing out Nebraska, or Georgia going on the road and being Texas, a top 5 team in college football right now? Y'all keep saying it's not fair, it's wrong, but what team has Indiana beaten this year that's on the same level as any team that they played relative to what's going on in the SEC? Nobody. No team Indiana has played is anywhere as good as what any team that's vying for a playoff spot in the SEC is right now. And that's facts. You keep saying I'm bragging about Alabama beating Wisconsin. I'm not bragging about Alabama beating Wisconsin. I'm using Alabama beating Wisconsin as the example of how dominant the SEC has been as a conference. You see, the SEC has been the best conference in college football for well over 2 decades. Y'all just don't want to admit it. You can't judge playoff teams vying for a spot in the dance the same way you're judging a potential one-loss Indiana team that if they lose to Ohio State, they wouldn't have a single win against any team ranked inside the college football playoff rankings. You mean to tell me that doesn't matter? Why are we rewarding teams that don't have ranked wins, that benefit off playing a weaker schedule relative to what these teams in the SEC are playing? But yet you're going to get mad when these SEC teams like to schedule these FCS opponents, because if you're putting in a one-loss Indiana team, you're basically saying it doesn't matter how difficult your schedule is, we care about the wins. We know that Alabama could beat all of the teams on Indiana's schedule. We know Georgia could beat all the teams on Indiana's schedule. They would be favored by multiple possessions to beat Michigan. We saw Texas slaughter Michigan in Ann Arbor. So the SEC has shown that not only have they been dominant against other P4 conferences, but they also have been the best conference in terms of quality of teams. You're 6 deep when it comes to playoff teams. The Big Ten only has 4 teams right now that are vying for a playoff spot. And you can make the argument that Penn State doesn't deserve to be in the playoffs because what's their best win? They don't have one. When you compare it to Ole Miss, Georgia, Texas, or Alabama, even Texas A&M. I'm just saying, strength of schedule has to matter. And putting in a one-loss Indiana team over a 2-loss SEC team wouldn't make a lot of sense, because you're saying that we don't care about how tough your schedule is. All we care is how dominant you look against the teams you play, when it's unfair, because most of the teams that Indiana has played against are nowhere as good as the teams a lot of these 2-loss SEC programs have played against. The SEC is a dogfight every single week. If you give Arkansas Indiana's schedule, they probably are in the same situation the Hoosiers are in right now. Not trying to demean Indiana, but a lot of y'all keep talking about the worst teams in the SEC. Stop bringing up Florida. Stop bringing up Auburn. Every conference has crappy teams. Northwestern is in the Big Ten. They suck. I can name plenty of teams in the Big Ten right now that are just as bad as Auburn, Florida, and the rest of the bottom feeders in the SEC. Every conference has bottom feeders. What we are talking about right now is the majority. The majority of the SEC clears the majority of the Big Ten. You can't tell me that playing in the SEC is the equivalent to the schedule that Indiana has played this year. The facts show otherwise. Georgia's 3 toughest games were on the road against Alabama, on the road against Texas, on the road against Ole Miss. Indiana hasn't played 3 teams nowhere as good as what those teams are. So I'm getting really confused with what these arguments are about. Because what are we talking about now, people? What are we talking about in this comment section? Because it's pretty clear that SEC, the gap between them and the Big Ten, is pretty large. You can't equate what conference you play in to the difficulty that it is playing in the Southeastern Conference. It has to matter. Strength of schedule has to matter. Who you play has to matter. You shouldn't be able to lose to Ohio State and still get in, not playing as difficult as the schedule as what these SEC teams have played. When the SEC and the Big Ten met, and they said that they wanted extra playoff spots guaranteed to them, and a lot of y'all got outraged by it, you weren't really thinking about how tough the SEC is in terms of depth and quality of teams. There are 7 teams that are vying for a playoff spot right now. The SEC has more teams in the playoff rankings than any other conference. If you were to have a Big Ten versus SEC tournament, the SEC would win. The SEC has a winning record against every other team outside of this conference. Yeah, you had a few games when Arkansas lost to Oklahoma State, but overall, the majority of the SEC has been better than the Big Ten, which for the last 4 or 5 years, the Big Ten has only been a 3-team conference. Prior to the Pac-12 teams joining the Big Ten, only 3 teams were relevant: Penn State, Michigan, and Ohio State. Every year in the SEC, there's about 4 or 5 elite teams. And this year, you got 6 teams that are in the playoff conversation. Come on now. I'm not asking Indiana to be every SEC team. What I'm asking is for Indiana to play a schedule on the same level of difficulty as what a lot of these 2-loss SEC teams have played. A lot of these 2-loss SEC teams only have 2 losses because they've had to play against each other. Indiana hasn't played a schedule as remotely as difficult this season compared to any other team in the SEC vying for a playoff spot, and it has to matter. How can you say you're one of the best 12 teams in college football when you haven't beaten a single team in the playoff rankings? Indiana, to get in, they got to beat Ohio State. As good as a story as what it's been for them, having their best season in program history, not everybody deserves to be in the playoffs because of what your record is. You're not always what your record says you are. And your strength of schedule has to matter. If you beat Ohio State, you deserve to be in the playoffs, regardless if you lose to Oregon in the Big Ten championship. But if you don't beat Ohio State, you don't deserve to get in because you don't have a single win against any team in the college football playoff rankings. At least Ohio State has beaten Penn State. That's what I'm trying to say. If Indiana beats Ohio State, they deserve to get in. But if you don't beat Ohio State, you don't have a strong case of getting into the playoffs over a 2-loss SEC team where all of these teams vying for a playoff spot in the SEC have played the strength of schedule that's ranked in the top 20 or higher in terms of difficulty. Now I got I got 2 more things that I want to get into before I get up on out of here. Who's the coach of the year in college football for this season? Is it Curt Cignetti, who has led Indiana to their best season in program history? This is the first time ever that they've won 10 games. They've had a point differential of 25.2, which is 4th best in the nation. And prior to Curt Cignetti's hiring, they've only had 5 winning seasons in the last 29 years. So do you go with Curt Cignetti as the coach of the year? Or do you go with Deion Sanders at Colorado, who has led Colorado to only their 2nd winning season in the last 18 years, which that came in 2016 when they went 10-4. And when Deion Sanders arrived at Colorado, he inherited a program that only won 1 game the year prior. He turned this program around from a 1-win team to not only a team that's now vying for the Big 12 championship, but also a playoff spot as well. He also has developed 2 Heisman frontrunners right now and 2 future top 5 picks in the draft next year, and Travis Hunter and Shedeur Sanders. And when you think about what Deion Sanders has meant to Colorado football, the prime effect is what people call it when he has increased the university's enrollment rates, he's increased viewership, he's brought in over $100 million in sponsorship monies and advertisement money. He has greatly not just improved Colorado football, but he has improved the community of Boulder, Colorado as well. So when you take all those things into the equation, who deserves to win Coach of the Year? Curt Cignetti or Deion Sanders? If Curt Cignetti gets Indiana to the college football playoffs, you got to give it to Curt Cignetti. This is something that Indiana has never done. They've never had a season this good, and they have only been known as a basketball school prior to him getting there. So I would go Curt Cignetti if Indiana gets into the CFP. But if Indiana loses to Ohio State, they get left out of the playoffs, you got no choice but to go with Deion Sanders. Even though what Curt Cignetti has done is a little bit more impressive because he's done something that has never happened at Indiana, Colorado football has been irrelevant since the beginning of time. And Colorado was not even favored to win more than 5.5 games coming into this season. So not only has Colorado massively overachieved, but they also won the Big 12 championship in their first season back in this conference, and Deion Sanders' second year with this program. Not only that, but you also have two players on the same team that could be Heisman finalists. So if Indiana doesn't make it to the playoffs, but Colorado wins their conference championship game and they get that auto bid with two Heisman finalists, you got to give Coach of the Year to Deion Sanders over Curt Cignetti. Now, if Colorado doesn't win the Big 12 championship and they don't get into the playoffs and neither does Indiana, then you have to give it to Curt Cignetti, because that would mean that Curt Cignetti had a more successful season than what Deion Sanders had in terms of wins and program expectations, with him being able to rebuild Indiana in less than a year. Shout out to everybody that's tuned in. Shout out to my guy, Panama Jack. He says, JT, I have to give you credit. Props on calling out Mario Cristobal in one of your videos. You hit it right. They lost to GT. Hey, I appreciate it, man. I appreciate it. Shout out to my guy, Todd L. He must be an Indiana Hoosiers fan. Shout out to my guy, M. Sparks. And the last thing I want to talk about, well, I might have a few more minutes. I think they're going to release the playoff rankings at 7:10. This is the worst season that Florida State has had in 50 years. They're on pace to finish with 2 wins this season, which is one of the worst seasons. Start that over, man. I don't like how we did that. Florida State is about to have the worst season, this is the worst season that Florida State football has had in over 50 years. They're on pace to finish with only 2 wins, which the last time Florida State had a season this bad, they went 0-11 in 1973. And I believe that this season has been so bad for Florida State and Mike Norvell that it has set this program back 3-4 years. Because what has caused Florida State to have this bad season is their inability to develop the players that they recruit out of high school. The only good players that Florida State has had that they've recruited out of high school has been Lawrence Toffoli, Patrick Payton, and their linebacker, DJ Lundy. Everybody else that's been an impact player for Florida State since Mike Norvell has been hired has come from the transfer portal. Jordan Travis, transfer from Louisville. Keon Coleman, transfer. Johnny Wilson, transfer. Jared Verse, Brandon Fisk, Fentrell Cypress. All of these guys are transfers. All of the players that have made it to the NFL, that have got drafted at the next level, have all come from the portal. So if you are a high school recruit, why would you want to play for a program that has been unable to develop anybody that they've gotten out of recruiting? And right now, Florida State has lost 5 4-stars in the last 2 months due to decommitments. They right now have the 34th or the 31st ranked recruiting class in America behind Duke, SMU, Georgia Tech, Clemson, and Miami. If Florida State is going to have a 1-year turnaround, you're basically saying that Mike Norvell is going to have to do the same thing that got Florida State into this situation anyway, which is overly relying on the transfer portal. You see, the transfer portal is only good when you have done a good job of recruiting and you mix it in. So therefore, you have a few recruits that are good, But when you got a few positions of needs where some of the guys that you recruited at some positions haven't really panned out, then you go into the portal and you get those portal guys to fill those areas of needs. But the portal is not something to be relied upon to solely build your team off. And that's what Florida State is. They are a portal-heavy team. A lot of their best players, they got from the transfer portal. They're not recruiting. Even Ole Miss, as portal-heavy as what they've been, some of the players they have starting for them, they developed through recruiting. Same thing with Georgia, Alabama, Miami. Some of their players have been developed through recruiting. Xavier Restrepo, one of the best receivers in Miami Hurricanes history, they developed him from recruiting. You know, all of the best teams in college football, they all dip into the transfer portal. But they also do a good job at developing the players that they get out of high school, which is Mike Norvell's biggest flaw. And that's why Florida State is in such a bad situation. You see, what people got wrong about Florida State coming into this season is that they based their expectations for the Seminoles this year solely based off what they did last year. What they overlooked is that this is a program that didn't have a lot of returning production that was really good. Same thing with Missouri. They lost the majority of their defense last year, plus their defensive coordinator. They were hopeful that the guys Florida State brought in via recruiting were good enough that with them getting the start this year and replace those portal guys that left for the NFL from that ACC title team would be good enough to fill the shoes of the guys who left. And it hasn't happened because this coaching staff has done a poor job of developing high school recruits. Why do you think Mark Novell just cleared house with nearly his entire coaching staff? He fired his OC. He fired his defensive coordinator. This is a program that is once again rebuilding. Mike Norvell, going into 2025, is entering the same situation that he walked into when he first took this FSU head coaching gig back in 2020. You got to rebuild Florida State from the ground up, because with how many misses that you've had via the portal and the recruiting, you got to start over again. And it's hard to see Florida State, despite how down the ACC is, bouncing back, going from what they are going to be this year when the season finishes to being a team that all of a sudden is going to be right back in contention for winning the ACC this year. With how bad Florida State season has gone, it has set this program back several years. And I don't think Mike Norvell is going to be able to recover from this, because it's one thing to have a down year, but it's one thing to go from 13-0, getting snubbed out of the playoffs, getting blown out by Georgia in the Orange Bowl, to being a 2-win program. That shows that you're not a good head coach. And it shows that you're not good at developing talent. Hell, Billy Napier has gotten more out of his freshman and sophomore players than what Florida State has gotten this year out of theirs. Florida State is in a really bad situation, and Florida State's future, I would describe it as a sinking ship, because that's what it is. I don't see how things get any better for Mike Norvell and Florida State with the misses that they've had in the portal and the misses that they've had in recruiting. Mark Norvell has had about 3-4 recruiting cycles now. All of these guys mostly should be on the field making plays, but they aren't. Why do you think we keep seeing a lot of these true freshmen or some of these second-year guys? Because a lot of the guys that Mark Norvell recruited from his first 2 recruiting classes haven't panned out. There's only 4 players that I've named earlier that have worked out that were high school recruits. What Mike Norvell has done at Florida State by over-relying on the transfer portal has hurt this program, because they can't develop high school recruits, so they dabble in the portal and think that they can already find somewhat already made prospects out of the portal that can come in and produce, but they still overlook, no matter who you get out of the portal, you still have to develop them. Like Jackson Dart wasn't a finished product. Lane Kiffin developed him. Same thing with Jordan Travis. All of the draft picks Florida State had last year were from the portal. And when you build your program through the portal, you have a hard time building a culture. And I knew Florida State was screwed, because I was talking to a FSU player before the season, right? And I asked him, how did you feel about that loss to Georgia? And I don't really want to detail completely what he told me, but from what he told me, Florida State didn't care about the game. They already knew they were going to get blown out. They already accepted the fact that they had no chance against Georgia with all their starters opting out. So they just opted to have a good time instead of also focusing on the game. And that's why the Orange Bowl was so one-sided. Now, I'm not going to say who told me this because you're never supposed to reveal your sources. But I am tapped in with a few players that play for Florida State, a few people that are connected to these FSU players, and I've talked to a couple of them. And just off that, from the few guys I talked to when I asked them about spring practice, how they feel about DJU, some of them told me they intentionally were dropping interceptions so they didn't hurt his confidence. And I'm not making this up. I'm pretty sure a lot of people who are also tapped into Florida State, who cover this program, who write about this program, they were hearing similar things, because if you know the same people I know, you will be able to reiterate everything I'm saying. It's factual. So Florida State right now, they're in a bad spot because your offensive line can't protect anybody. They can't open up holes in the running game. And your defensive line is struggling to get after the quarterback. FSU, these next 2-3 years under Mike Norvell, I feel are going to be rebuilding years. And I don't see this being a one-off season when they bounce back instantly next year. They could be down for a while. They may not be a 1 or 2 win team next season. They probably could get back to bowl eligibility, but I don't see Florida State being a contender for the ACC title or the college football playoffs for at least the next couple of years, with how bad this season has been, how bad they've recruited and developed talent out of high school, and how overly dependent they've been on the transfer portal. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before I get up on out of here, college football has a quitting problem. I was all for guys being able to transfer whenever they wanted to, being granted instant eligibility to play, but I'm not for guys quitting on their teams mid-season just because they get benched or they're not getting the playoff time they feel they deserve. And with how this is going, it's going to make it incredibly difficult for a lot of teams that have depth. The transfer portal is the biggest reason why Georgia is struggling this season. They don't have a lot of depth at receiver, on the offensive line, on defense. Every time people ask Kirby Smart about Georgia's depth issue, how does he feel about it? He says we have depth at no position because it's hard to keep depth when guys instantly transfer, when they know they're not going to start, when they know they're about to lose their job, and it hurts you in the middle of the season, because the thing that these guys who are transferring mid-season fail to understand is that you're always one injury away from getting an opportunity. And in football, one man's misfortune can turn into another man's opportunity. But with all of these guys getting in their feelings when they don't start or they're not getting a lot of snaps, they feel like, you know what, I'm just finna hit the portal, and you don't even give it until the season's end. You're just flat out quitting on your team, which is something that I don't agree with. And it's hard to field a competitive team consistently when you don't know who's going to stay and who's going to leave. At this point, you don't know when your players are going to transfer. You don't even know if the guys that are your second stringers right now, any day, could just say, you know what? I don't want to play no more. I'm just going to redshirt the rest of the season, and I'm going to enter my name in the portal. It's hard to establish, rules and regulations in the NCAA because of how many teams there are. Every conference having different rules and guidelines, and it just isn't a good regulation body in terms of keeping these transfer issues under wraps. Because I don't feel like it's fair to these coaches or it's fair to these teams that these players can just quit whenever they want to in the middle of the season and hurt the team in terms of depth. And I actually feel like it's pretty soft. I know a few homies that transfer that aren't playing right now, and they are going to transfer, but they're not quitting on their team mid-season. You know, like, I feel like it's really a sucky situation right now to be in if you're Kirby Smart. And I get it that a lot of you guys don't feel bad for these coaches because your logic is these coaches can up and leave whenever they want to for new jobs. And that is true. But these coaches, although they may have their mind made up on leaving for a better job, they're not quitting on their teams in the middle of the season. They're leaving for these new jobs once the season is over. These players are quitting on their teams, and we still got 3-4 more games left, not including the bowl games, the playoff games. You don't know who ahead of you could get injured. And the transfer portal is now starting to be a big problem in college football. What used to be something that everybody wanted has now become a nightmare because teams don't have depth. And now you got guys that just have the power to up and leave whenever they want to. It's to the point now where you've created a really bad environment when it comes to the honesty between the player and coach, because now coaches can't afford to be upfront with players about where they rank on the depth chart. If you are a guy who's a backup, the coach may not be wanting to tell you you're a backup because he knows that he's going to need you in case one guy gets injured. You're the next man up, but you don't want to stay and be the backup because you feel you're good enough to start elsewhere. And that's where the problem lies. That's why you got a lot of players who complain about the dishonesty with coaches when they're in a situation where they got no choice but to be dishonest, because if they tell the truth and they tell you that you're the second or third stringer, you're going to transfer and they're not going to have any depth. And these players are a little bit stupid, in my opinion, because they fail to understand that football is a very violent and physical sport. Guys drop like flies left and right. You can't watch a single football game now without at least two guys getting injured during the game. And when injuries happen, that's your chance to step up, take advantage of the opportunity. And if you outplay the guy who was starting in front of you, you potentially could take his job or set yourself up for a better opportunity elsewhere because you got film out there. I had a homeboy last year that played for FAU. He was a preferred walk-on. He entered the transfer portal. And when he entered the portal, I hit him up. I was like, bro, what the hell are you doing entering the portal? You have the opportunity as a walk-on player with the new coaching staff that doesn't know who any of you guys are to, set a good precedent for yourself. You got a clean slate. And if you're good enough in his eyes, he's not going to care if you're a preferred walk-on. He's not going to know that. And when he types your name up in the computer and sees that you're a preferred walk-on, he's going to offer you a scholarship instantly. When you get a new head coach, it's a new opportunity to prove yourself because you got a clean slate. Nobody's holding anything against you. But he told me that he was entering the portal because he was looking to get paid. I said, dude, how are you going to get paid when you only got 5 snaps from last season? What game film do you have to warrant getting a big payday? You feel me? So you know what he did after I had that conversation with him? He deleted his transfer post. He withdrew his name out of the portal. And he still is a member of FAU's football team. You see, it's hard to get a scholarship to play Division I football and college football. No matter if you're playing at Kennesaw State or Alabama, I always got a lot of respect for anybody that gets offered the opportunity to play at the highest level of college football, because a lot of people don't understand how difficult it is to get that, how difficult it is to even have the opportunity to play football on scholarship for free at a school like FAU, FIU, USF. They may be irrelevant in terms of the rest of the landscape in college football, but at least it gives you an opportunity to get to the next level. If you transfer out, there's a good chance that you may end up having to bump down a step. I know guys that played at Alabama, that played at Miami, and ended up finishing their careers playing NAIA. You go from playing in sold-out stadiums of 70,000 to playing in a stadium that only sits 150 people because you weren't willing to wait your turn. You weren't willing to understand that in football, one man's misfortune can turn into your opportunity. The NCAA has to do something about this transfer problem, this quitting problem. There's a rumor on the street that when Lincoln Riley benched Miller Moss, he instantly transferred. Are you kidding me? The dude who you're the backup to now may get injured the next game, and you may be right back in the fold as the starter again. We got the quitting problem in college football, and it's hurting the sport. That's why Georgia's having a down season, because they don't have depth. Same thing with Ohio State. Same thing with a lot of other teams. A lot of people felt the transfer portal would bring more parity in college football. And that's happened to some degree. But it also has hurt more teams than it's benefited, because no coach, no matter if you're coaching at FAU, FIU, Kennesaw State, or Alabama, knows who's going to be on their roster when they wake up. When you're Kellen DeBoer and you wake up, a third stringer could transfer. You could have your fourth string wide receiver transfer, and then 3 of your starters get injured, and you have no depth. Look at Oklahoma this year. Oklahoma has been depleted with injuries everywhere. Offensive line, receivers, and they have no depth, because a lot of those guys who would have been depth, who could have been solid contributors, are in the portal because they quit on their team. This is it for this episode of JT Sports Live. I appreciate you guys for tuning in, and I'll see you guys tomorrow when we do our NFL Wednesday live streams. Before we get up on out of here, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed. Give us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast from. Apple, Spotify, Amazon. The JT Sports Podcast is available. The links are down in the description down below.